Brace yourself.
I'm going to go out on a limb here and say that Pokémon Snap for the Nintendo 64 is one of the most important games in the franchise ever released. Yeah, it's not one of the main RPGs, but it set some pretty powerful precedents for what was possible for Nintendo's legendary series. It was the franchise's infancy. Even though it had already captured the hearts of kids everywhere, Pokémon's foray onto the Nintendo 64 was a new world. It was the first time we saw full 3D models of Pokémon roaming the game space, and that's easily why it holds significance for many people. But it's not just a landmark Pokémon game. It shows what the rail shooter can do when operating under different rule sets. As a genre that combined high-action shooting with linear and generally scripted design, it's shocking that one of the few games to really change the design mentality behind the rail shooter was Pokémon Snap. And it did this in ways that feel, on the surface anyway, counterintuitive toward the genre's core elements. Pokémon Snap has you taking on the role of Todd Snap, who is a far cry from the Pokémon trainers we've grown to know and love. Instead, he's a photographer who spends his time taking pictures of Pokémon in their natural habitats. He meets up with longtime Pokémon researcher Professor Oak and departs to Pokémon Island, a locale where Pokémon run wild without the influence of human interaction and their horrific cockfight regime. The goal is to take pictures of Pokémon, deliver the photos to Professor Oak, and have him rate how good the photos are. The criteria for that are definitely sketchy, as Oak's grading is based on some pretty inconsistent data regarding each Pokémon's size and reactions, along with the player's own skill. It's a straightforward goal that definitely feels restrictive, at least compared to what we're used to out of a Pokémon game. There's no tactic building from such a passive viewpoint, and it's clear that Pokémon's initial journey into full 3D was not the RPG journey that many were expecting in the late 90s. What makes this all the more confining is the fact that Pokémon Snap is on rails. You're on a predestined track in Professor Oak's 01 vehicle. You can't backtrack in a single run, so missing a key photography shot has a large degree of penalty. The on-rails status limits the player's interaction even further since you're restricted in where you go and when. Missed opportunities are costly since you have to restart a stage entirely to recoup losses. And though you later get the dash engine upgrade which lets you move faster through a stage, it's only a mild improvement over a slow and meandering pace. Your main mechanic is the camera. Holding the Z trigger lets you prepare the shot, while pressing A lets you take a photo. When the aiming reticle is red, the photo can be successfully taken, and the Pokémon successfully identified. While you can photograph Pokémon outside of the center of the screen, it's not ideal, as Professor Oak's grade will be lower than if the Pokémon is properly centered. You can aim in all directions, and can even aim backwards, so despite being on rails, your viewpoint is flexible. You eventually unlock additional items like the Pokémon food to lure them to specific areas, the Pester Ball as a more offensive projectile, and the Poké Flute to make them perform specific actions. It's a pretty small repertoire of abilities, so Pokémon Snap relies more on its world design than its mechanics to provide interesting moments. This is as far as you'll get when it comes to interacting with the Pokémon on the island. But that's where Pokémon Snap shines. Pokémon Snap's core concept is that this is the first time in Pokémon history that we have fully rendered wild Pokémon running around in a game. Think about it, up until now Pokémon have acted more as basic static RPG mechanics, items if you will. They may be based on various animals, but in Pokémon Red, Blue, and Yellow they certainly didn't act like animals. You encountered them in the wild, but they didn't present that sense of liveliness. They felt more as obstacles than living, breathing animal enemies. Pokémon Snap, on the other hand, has Pokémon totally untouched by human influence. From the start, Pidgey fly into your view, a Doduo bursts from a nearby bush, Lapras gently lean their necks over the ocean waves. These are wild animals acting like wild animals do. This is absolutely incredible, and it's something that I feel many Pokémon fans, and gamers altogether, really took for granted when Pokémon Snap came out. Sure, Pokémon Snap wasn't a full-fledged RPG, you couldn't battle Pokémon, and not all 151 Pokémon were present, but it showed Pokémon in an entirely new light. The Pokémon acted independently of human influence, spending more time interacting with each other. It was the world beyond the veil of battling, gym leaders, and the Pokémon League, and the first time we got to see Pokémon as opposed to Pokémon as mechanics. It's interesting that no other game in the series really approached Pokémon in this way, even since this game's release in the 90s. Pokémon Channel and Mystery Dungeon had them acting as goofy cartoon characters, Super Smash Bros. Had them acting like mascots, and future Pokemon RPGs continued to use them as tools and moves for battling. Pokemon Snap is Pokemon acting like animals. No other game has really done that since. So when this all comes together, Pokemon Snap is about interacting with autonomous Pokemon on a passive level. You can't control the navigation of your vehicle directly, and can't control Pokemon actions directly. So how are we, as the player, supposed to derive agency from something that is essentially a static, passive tour guide? Well, Pokemon Snap is, at its core, an on-rails shooter, but it's less about what and where you shoot, and more on how you shoot. The core gameplay is more about using your items to solve puzzles, which can lead to better pictures. It's a combination of precision and problem solving, a merging of two very different genres, first-person shooting and puzzles. The interesting thing is that Pokemon Snap can't really function without elements from both of these genres. If you just go for a good shot without solving any kind of brain-teasing interaction, you can get a good shot, but miss a potentially better one. If you just solve a puzzle and get a neat pose but don't manage to get a precise angle, your score will suffer. The goal is to solve a particular puzzle with your repertoire of items and moves, then get the right shot to score a higher bonus photograph. This element actually contributes to the gameplay considerably. Because Pokemon are acting independently of human influence, we, the player, are left in a relatively passive profile. Pokemon's actions in Pokemon Snap are scripted, but the player's agency is knowing what these scripted sequences are and capturing them on film. While you can earn items to make Pokemon perform certain poses or moves, your interaction with the Pokemon's actions is still very limited. But that's Pokemon Snap's challenge, using your toolset and your skill with the camera to photograph these sequences in the best possible form. Let's take a look at a relatively early example of this. After traveling to the second level, the tunnel, the player can earn the Pokemon food. This can be thrown to lure Pokemon to a specific area. Early in the very first level, the player will find a Pikachu on the right-hand side. Throwing this Pokemon food in a trail toward a nearby surfboard will have Pikachu run towards it, jump, and pose atop it. Taking a snapshot of Pikachu in this pose will offer the player a bonus from Professor Oak. Surfing Pikachu can net you more points than if Pikachu was photographed without using the food. So we're given the opportunity to try out new items to enhance the bonuses obtained by photography. We can use the autonomy of the Pokemon as a jumping off point to involve ourselves in the world, even though it's very passive. Pokemon Snap's slower, more leisurely pace encourages this kind of curiosity, giving us a reason to learn about the Pokemon's patterns and their behaviors. Pokemon Snap's spin on the rail shooter is unorthodox. It acts as an all-ages alternative to the shooters we know and love, but I think it's actually more than that. What seemed like a pacified and non-violent approach to the shooter is actually something contemplative and strategic. The slower pace lets the player aim more carefully and set up shots with greater control. Pokemon act in animated but non-confrontational ways, encouraging the player to experiment with the Pokemon instead of avoiding them. The ability to see 360 degrees from your vehicle makes the world feel open and free, compelling you to look around and investigate without fear of danger. By defusing much of the danger of the on-rails shooter and draining away the action, Pokemon Snap is inviting and encouraging for the player to visually explore the world, even though reserved to a single path in a very passive way. Pokemon Snap is unique. It's a rail shooter without the danger or direct penalty, but its passiveness and leisurely pace end up producing a more investigative and curious approach to the genre. It carefully balances the incentives of high scores with a pace that's accommodating and relaxing, perfectly tuned for getting a good shot. Everything Pokemon Snap does is slower and less intense than what you'd expect from the on-rail shooter genre. But it all benefits a goal to support how you shoot instead of just what you shoot. Sure, it doesn't have that white-knuckle intensity, and at its core, it's still a very passive and agency-limiting game. But Pokemon Snap is, to this day, one of the most evolutionary rail shooters ever seen.